A killer that's slowly creeping up on us. How can we beat it? Plus, getting the count right as election night becomes election week. And from the U.S. Senate to your county commission, what do the results of state and local races mean for Kansans? Where are we going from here? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.
I'm Pilar Pedraza. Welcome to a special election edition of Kansas Week. With the votes in and winners declared, mostly, we move on to figuring out what this means for our state and our lives. Let's begin with a look at the races for the U.S. Senate and House here in Kansas. Half of Kansas congressional delegation will be freshmen this year. Roger Marshall came out on top as Kansas' new senator-elect, surviving one of the longest, hardest-fought races in state history, a race fueled with out-of-state money and attack ads, as Democrats had hoped to break their losing streak in Kansas for the first time since the Great Depression and help flip the Senate. Marshall credits the Wichita metro area with his win Tuesday night, a win that got vice presidential notice.
Mr. Vice President, always great to talk to you. I've got my wife standing beside me here. Will you tell her hi as well for me?
Please say congratulations.
Democrat Barbara Bollier conceded the race with praise for her team and a promise her campaign will have changed politics in Kansas. She told supporters by Zoom that their bipartisan efforts put national and state politicians on notice, that they need more than an R or a D by their name to get Kansans' votes.
Yet our finest moments were not defined by what we accomplished. It was how. There is no substitute for honesty and integrity, and these values fueled our race to the end.
In the U.S. House, former Lieutenant Governor Tracy Mann will fill Marshall's seat in the big 1st District from western Kansas, while State Treasurer Jake LaTurner is Kansas' new representative from the 2nd District. Both incumbents on the ticket, Democrat Sharice Davids in the 3rd District and Republican Ron Estes here in the 4th, held off challengers to return to Washington. And the big question now, what does all this mean for Kansans? Here to help answer that, we have Dr. Neil Allen, political scientist from Wichita State University, in studio with us. And joining us by Zoom, his colleague, Dr. Patrick Miller from the University of Kansas. Thank you so much, both of you. Patrick, I'm going to start with you. What does this mean? What do you see out of these as being the biggest headlines as we look at the Senate and House races?
Well, I think everything was very much status quo. None of the seats flipping. You know, you look at the Senate race, we knew that it was a close race among those who had an opinion, a bit of a lead for Marshall on average, but we knew that those undecideds in the Senate race, you know, they leaned pretty strongly to Donald Trump for president. And we know from the exit polls that there was a movement among late voters to Republicans. So I think the polling was actually not too bad in Kansas, if you remember that you had undecideds with some political leanings. I think, though, a status quo result really does disguise some of the interesting ways that Kansas is changing, particularly suburban versus rural Kansas, as we saw on the map. And there'll be some trends there to watch for the state as we go forward.
And Neil, as we look at that, he mentioned the polls. There has been a lot of talk about the polls being wrong in this race. Were they wrong?
Well, I think if you look at margin of error in polls, and remember that if a poll has a margin of error of plus or minus 4 percentage points, that's for each candidate's total, so it can be much wider. Mm-hmm. And I think if you average the polls, you would find that probably Bollier would be a little closer to Marshall, but also, like Patrick said, there was a lot of undecideds in all polls, and frankly, more undecideds here in Kansas than you see in other states. And the statewide race for president was on, Trump did a little better than expected, but not a massive margin. Mm-hmm. And what I was really interested in is the fact that Bollier did not run substantially better than Biden did, only maybe 2 or 3 percentage points ahead of him. And I think that's going to be true of the congressional races too. Even in the 2nd District, where Michelle Della Isla ran a very active campaign, and but it looks like they were basically following the top of the ticket here in Kansas like everywhere else.
Yeah. So as we look at this, we had mentioned in the pre-produced piece, about half of Kansas's congressional delegation, depending on how you count it, is going to be freshmen this year. And Patrick, I'm going to start with you on this. How does that impact our congressional delegation's ability to advocate for Kansas in D.C.?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, with the way that Congress is changing internally and a lot of the norms in Congress, seniority, it's not that it doesn't count anymore, but it definitely doesn't count for as much as it used to, especially in the Republican caucus and how they have their rules set up for committee leadership and so forth. So if you have a whole bunch of new freshmen, then, you know, at the margins, you might see some areas where that influence of seniority is lost, although the members that are outgoing also hadn't been there that long. I suspect we're looking more in the direction of really, you know, low impact with that. Losing Pat Roberts and any seniority he has, I think, is a bigger impact than necessarily the cycling out of relatively junior House members.
And certainly losing Pat Roberts, we've known was going to happen for a while. Roger Marshall, a freshman in the Senate, but not a freshman to D.C.
That's right, although he's only been in there 2 terms and he didn't have any elected office experience before. That also, for Kansas agriculture, there may be some effect, because while Marshall will probably get on the Senate Agriculture Committee and Tracy Mann will be likely be on the House Agriculture Committee, we have a lot less seniority there, and also there's some shifts in other committee positions that might hurt Kansas, because the House Agriculture Committee Chair Colin Peterson from Minnesota just got beat, and he's a big defender of corn, soybeans, wheat. But the new chair of agriculture might be someone from Georgia, for example, where they have more specialty crops and like to push more subsidies onto, frankly, as a son of an Indiana corn and soybean farmer, crops that are not as suitable to growing in America, and like cotton and rice and sugar that need a lot more subsidy. And so on the margins, that might hurt us in Kansas, at least for a while.
All right. Well, lots there. We certainly are not going to stop talking about the Senate and the House, but we also have some races in the State House to discuss. Several headlines coming out of those races there that could impact your lives for the next decade, ranging from some surprise endings to the Republican majority. This year, voters decided to send more Republicans to the State House, increasing the party's supermajority in the Kansas House and Senate. This despite efforts from Democrats to eat into that supermajority, maybe even end it. In the short term, it means Republicans will be able to override any veto from Democratic Governor Laura Kelly and control what issues lawmakers even discuss. In the long term, it means they'll be the ones drawing new district lines based on the U.S. Census results, giving the Republican Party the ability to draw those lines to benefit Republican candidates, something called gerrymandering.
In possibly the state Senate, is you could take the Wichita area, where right now we have 2 Democratic seats in Wichita, 2 that are Republican but are close, and you could turn it conceivably to 1 solid Democrat and 3 solid Republicans if you're real aggressive.
At least one of those new Republicans in the state Senate will take a major bite out of Democratic leadership. At this point, it looks like Rick Clues will upset veteran Senator Anthony Hensley, who's been in the seat for 4 decades. Clues believes that duration may be why he won, saying he heard about term limits a lot, even from Democrats, while campaigning. And Democratic leadership has signaled it will try to oust one of its own from the Kansas House as soon as he's sworn in. 20-year-old Aaron Coleman made headlines during the campaign for admitting to circulating revenge porn and facing charges at the age of 14 of threatening to shoot a high school student. He won his race Tuesday, but by Wednesday, the Associated Press reports a political operative was already circulating a tweet from Coleman predicting Governor Kelly would face an extremely bloody primary in 2022, saying, quote, "I'm not playing around. People will realize one day when I call a hit out on you, it's real." Coleman admitted to the AP he sent the tweet, adding he deleted it because he'd meant it to say a political hit. House Minority Leader Tom Sawyer called the tweet a threat, though, and said Democrats will file a complaint and seek to oust Coleman from his newly won seat. And in Wichita, retired North High teacher Stephanie Byers made headlines when she won her race this week to become the state's first openly transgender state lawmaker.
For a lot of people in the LGBT community and outside of the LGBT community, it seems that our status it sometimes can seem like a barrier to be able to give ourselves completely and totally to public service.
And Neil, I'm going to start with the same question I started with Patrick on the last segment. To you, what's the biggest headline as we're looking at the State House races?
It's clearly that it was a really good year for Republicans. There's still going to be some recounts going forward. These are smaller seats, and so there's very close results either way, and there's still provisional ballots to be counted in many places. But the Republicans had a really good night. The state Senate looks like it'll still be 29 Republicans and 11 Democrats, but those Republicans are going to be significantly more conservative and party loyalists than in the last Senate. And so, for example, if Medicaid expansion comes up, I'm not even sure that there's 21 votes there, let alone the 27 you would need to get it to the floor over the objections of the party leadership. The State House is probably the more moderate chamber right now. I think the Democrats might be able to, on various issues, join with moderate Republicans, although their conservatives have also gained. And also, we see here that Democrats, where they picked up was around in Johnson County in northeastern Kansas, but Democrats are just rapidly becoming extinct outside of central Wichita and northeast. They lost a seat in Newton. They lost a seat in South Wichita that leans somewhat conservative. They lost their last southeastern Kansas representative from Pittsburgh. And so it's just a really, it's a strong result for Republicans, particularly for conservative Republicans.
Patrick, I'm going to ask you, agree or disagree on this?
Well, I mean, I agree. It's a win for Republicans, particularly for conservative Republicans. The changes are actually very marginal in the legislature. I mean, 0 in the state Senate, probably going to be single digits in the state House. But even marginal to 0 change has big consequences in the sense of preserving the Republican supermajority, especially when you consider how moderate Republicans were really gutted in the primaries. So that caucus does become more conservative, and it puts conservatives in a much stronger position to try to override the governor's veto on a whole host of policies: education spending, taxes, budget issues, social issues, but also obviously for redistricting. And I think conservative Republicans will have a lot more power, and I think it will be interesting to watch how aggressive they choose to be in exercising that power, in drawing maps and pulling state policy back more in the direction of, say, pre-2016, when they had a lot more power.
And Patrick, I'm going to stay with you really quickly for this next question. How much does it hurt Democrats to have lost Anthony Hensley in the Senate? I sat in committee meetings, in floor debates, and seen him orchestrate activity because he just knows the system so well that it almost gave the Democrats a power outstripping the size of their delegation.
Well, I mean, obviously losing a senior member, someone who's in leadership, is, not good for any party. I mean, he had to retire at some point anyway, and that loss at some point, whether through retirement or election, would inevitably lead to maybe a new generation of leadership for Democrats, and the Democrats who are there, asserting themselves in some ways they had it in the past. So, I mean, it is obviously a loss. Democrats will have to adapt to that as best they can, just like everyone in the legislature will have to adapt to the new reality. Senator Hensley, his district's right across the street from mine. It actually is a more Republican district. It was never actually a Democratic district, and he held that for quite a long time against the partisan odds. And I think with as little ticket splitting as there appeared to have been this year, it was just not his year.
All right. Well, we do have other races closer to home as we're moving, obviously, from wide to tight. Here in Sedgwick County, one race that stood out was the one for County Commission District 2, held by Michael O'Donnell. After a scandal broke just weeks before Election Day, O'Donnell said he would resign if reelected, allowing the local Republican Party to name his replacement. And now, KAKE's Eli Higgins shows us there are 3 people who say they want his seat when O'Donnell resigns, assuming he wins it.
These are kind of crazy times.
It's just the strangest thing ever, to sit there and cheer for what was your opponent.
It's been a roller coaster few days for Cindy Miles and Kathleen Garrison. They both ran against Sedgwick County Commissioner Michael O'Donnell in the 2020 primary.
I'm kind of a big picture person. My hope is that we can all come together and heal.
My hope there between the parties is to bring people together and to be able to work across party lines.
Garrison and Miles are each re-entering the race for Commissioner Michael O'Donnell's seat. But they're not the only ones. With a term limit approaching, Wichita City Councilman Jeff Blubaugh is also interested.
I hope that we get there, and I hope that we get to the point where we can trust one another, work well, and know that everybody that's signing their name to run for these offices, they're doing it to better serve their public.
Over the weekend, O'Donnell announced he would resign if reelected after he was heard on tape discussing his role in a smear campaign in last year's mayoral election. But several things need to happen before the Republican Party would be able to replace O'Donnell. First, the election results will have to be finalized. If O'Donnell still wins over his opponent, Sarah Lopez, then he would actually have to voluntarily step down like he said he would. If that happens, then the process of finding his replacement begins.
It would be up to the Sedgwick County Republican precinct captains in Commission District 2. Those individuals were actually elected in August to fulfill that purpose. And so this isn't new. Both parties have used this before.
Now, as of recording, we have not heard that Michael O'Donnell has sent in that resignation letter. Kind of has to be named, I guess, the winner first. How long, though, would he have roughly to take care of that for that to happen?
Well, the term starts in January, so I think technically he would have, he could resign or any time. I'm not sure about the mechanics of this. I mean, normally there's not a good reason to figure out how somebody can leave a race seat before they even take it up. But also, just to go on my own soapbox here, there's a bit of a problem here in Kansas and how we fill vacant seats, because that we have terms that are even at the very beginning, and then we're putting people in them with votes of party officials that most voters haven't heard of, most voters don't know who they are, and don't really have anything to do with selecting. I think the number of people here would be like 43 people, and this would be to pick someone who's going to serve in a very important position that's on our local health board, as well as being the county commission, and also pays over $90,000, so is very attractive for other politicians. It seems like every single Sedgwick County person who is in the state legislature at some point runs for county commission. So yeah, it's a complicated sort of situation.
Well, and certainly what we're looking at right here is this. In this case, it would be a 2-year term until the next election. But when we're talking about state lawmakers, that's just the next term.
Right, and also in this situation, it's very unique, of course, because if we'd known how corrupt Michael O'Donnell was and what he'd been doing in violation of morals and ethics and laws months ago, then he could have not run or lost his primary. If we'd even known about it a month ago, there might have even been time for an organized write-in campaign. But now we're stuck with this very weird kind of quasi-campaign of several Republicans from that district. And there's actually been a couple of others floated their names too, including a sitting state representative.
Yeah. Well, and Patrick, I'm going to turn to you on this one, but this is not unusual when we're talking about state races. I know a couple of years ago, roughly a quarter of the state house, they got their jobs as state lawmakers the same way.
Oh, absolutely. The process that we have here in Kansas, it is not unique to Kansas, but it is a process that we have over time seen states move away from. Legislatures and local offices, it used to be that appointments were the norm like this, but over time we've seen states moving towards special elections for these offices. And here in Kansas, we do have quite a track record of a large percentage of our legislature getting appointed to that office by really a very small handful of party activists who are precinct chairs. And not even all those precinct chair positions are filled. There's so many vacancies in those. So you really have a question, I think, for the health of democracy, where you have someone who has that much power over policy being selected in a way that shuts out the vast majority of the people in a district. Now, I don't actually think we're going to change that in Kansas, because the current system empowers party activists and empowers party to reward spoils, reward goods like this. There's not a big incentive to change that, but I don't think that we do it in the way that invites the most participation from citizens.
All right. And the race between Michael O'Donnell and Sarah Lopez is actually still in doubt, with just 32 votes between them, and the county, like the rest of the state and the rest of the country, is still counting those mail-in ballots. KAKE's Greg Miller shows us how that's going and why it's a normal thing.
As Election Day becomes election days, the counting continues.
The days after the election, things are going as planned.
The final tallies are still being collected. Wednesday alone, 17,000 mail-in ballots arrived to state polling places, and legally, they can be taken in. Then next week, there are the provisional ballots. Those are the ballots handed out to voters who may have forgotten an ID or gone to the wrong polling place, for example.
It's an election process. It's not just one day, but it's a process, and we do our best to educate the voters on the process.
And they could make a big difference in close races.
There are a handful of close races in the Kansas House, the Kansas Senate. There's also a State Board of Education race that is very close. At this point, we're letting the process play out.
But under Kansas law, any recount would come at the cost of the candidate. And while so much focus is on counting days after the polls closed, the Secretary of State's office emphasizes this process is completely normal.
You have election night. It is routine for us to count ballots that are postmarked on or before election day and received after. That's part of the process.
And Patrick, really, there's no consensus state to state on this counting process and how long states accept ballots. And that's kind of part of the confusion that people are seeing across the country right now, right?
Right. So in our system in America, states run elections, and then so much of the power also gets devolved down to the county level. You really have a great diversity in the requirements from state to state when it comes to voter registration, the process for requesting a ballot, when those ballots have to be received by. You know, here in Kansas, those ballots have to be postmarked by election day, and they have until the Friday after the election to arrive. So the day we're recording this. In other states, those ballots have to be returned by the day before the election. In some states, you can start counting those ballots before the election. In other states, you can't start counting them until after or the day of. So there really is a great disparity in this that I think, especially for those of us who just imagine that we all just go vote on one day and magically that night we have results. That's not really how it works, because there's different kinds of ballots and the process for counting them is just so disparate between states.
And Neil, I know you and I talked long before this election day got here that this was going to be a year for patience.
Right, and you know, we want our officials in counties and states to take their time to get things right. And we don't want them to have lots of pressure to count things quickly, because actually if you ever have problems, then like tabulation errors and things like that, that can really affect how people understand the election. But right now, sitting on a Friday where it seems like that Joe Biden's across the threshold for president, but we still have to count lots of ballots in lots of states, we should remember, you know, we'll have a new president in January, we'll have a new legislature in January. The country will go on about the same kind of way it's been now. And you know, it is, you know, there is a lot of confusion, but I think by next week we'll probably get some relief with settled races. And frankly, most Kansans probably don't even realize that there are runoffs to go in provisional ballots and all these kind of things. And I think, at least in our state, it's reasonable to trust election officials. And as we see across the country, these are people that take their job very seriously, and we have seen no issues so far with any irregularities.
All right. Well, Neil, Patrick, thank you both so much for your input today. We're going to end tonight on a slightly different note, a pandemic, but we're not talking about COVID-19. There's another pandemic out there. Diabetes also deserves our attention, and November is Diabetes Awareness Month. Channel 8's Chris Frank talks with a diabetic patient and his Wichita physician who tells us Kansans have advantages some regions don't have in resisting the disease.
82-year-old Leon Krob and his wife Judy make regular visits to their physician at the KU School of Medicine Wichita campus. It's a practice the couple urges others to do also.
Hello, good to see you again.
Leon has been managing type 2 diabetes since his diagnosis about 20 years ago.
How have your blood sugars been doing?
Really pretty well. Their physician, Dr. Tiffany Schwesinger-Schmidt, helps the Krobs deal with Leon's diabetes.
The scary thing about diabetes is a lot of people go undiagnosed.
Early diagnosis, she says, is critical.
And so that's why it's so important that we catch people early. We intervene early with lifestyle changes and medications if we need to be able to prevent that development of diabetes.
The documentary Blood Sugar Rising points out some of the alarming statistics about diabetes in America.
In the United States, it is estimated that there's about 100 million people with diabetes and pre-diabetes, 100 million people in the country affected by a blood sugar problem.
It's a staggering number, nearly 1/3 the U.S. population. But why?
So it used to be, if you think back, 20, 30, even 40 years, at that time, a lot of times we were seeing the type 1 diabetics. So diabetes that was due to the autoimmune, where the body is attacking itself and destroying those insulin-producing cells. But what we've seen as the environment has changed and as our genetics have changed responding to the environment, we're seeing more of those type 2 diabetics, where your body just becomes insensitive to the insulin that it produces. And unfortunately, the more weight that people gain, the more their body doesn't respond to that insulin. And so that's why we're seeing more and more cases of diabetes on the rise.
She says changes to our diets, including eating more processed foods and having larger food proportions, leads to more obesity and more diabetes. She also blames a lack of exercise and being more sedentary than earlier generations. But she says Kansas residents have an advantage of residing in a more rural state where they can still grow their own food.
People that tend to be in more rural settings, they have less access to fast food, they have more homegrown food, they have more space to get out and exercise, whereas people in urban settings tend to have more of what we call food deserts.
Judy says Leon got highly motivated to control his diabetes.
He was very determined to get his blood sugars down.
They work together in combating the disease.
It takes both of us. I couldn't do it by myself.
And Dr. Schwesinger-Schmidt says there are federal programs available to help identify those at risk and get them engaged in healthy lifestyle changes. Such changes are helping Leon Krob live a close to normal life with diabetes. For Kansas Week, this is Chris Frank.
Now, the KU Medical School says millions of Americans go undiagnosed because they can't get examined by a physician. But there are things we can all do right now to stave off this ailment. Dr. Schwesinger-Schmidt advises her patients to select foods from the outer aisles at their grocery store. She says that's where most of the fresh food is, saying the inner store shelves often have more of the highly processed foods with sugars and higher carbs. To learn more about this growing problem, check out the PBS documentary Blood Sugar Rising. It airs next Thursday, November 12th at 8 p.m. here on KPTS Channel 8. It explores the spread of the disease in the U.S. and how Americans are dealing with it. And on that note, stay safe and have a great week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.